this project probably sits, I guess, on the shoulders of research, particularly done by the Challenging Racism Project over the last decade, but also many others that have looked at Islamophobia in Australia. This is looking particularly at Victoria, but I think one of the key things about this is that we've done a survey of 4,000 Victorians looking at type and prevalence of Islamophobia. But importantly, and this is where it builds on other research, we conducted a latent class analysis of that sentiment, which is basically a fancy term for methodology, which looks at segments sentiment, I guess, so places people in categories or groups based on how they answered particular questions around it. And then we used, I guess, that segmentation, that latent class analysis, those groups, to then look at the sort of roles and drivers, particularly for policy and practice, in terms of the interventions that could be made across those 5 groups, which I'll talk about just quickly in a minute. So I think that's the key thing. It's like Islamophobia sentiment. It's like we know Islamophobia manifests in many different ways. Therefore, can we try and understand this problem a little bit more by segmenting groups and then trying to develop interventions that could meet the particular categorizations of those groups. So findings, just briefly, Islamophobia is widespread in Victoria. From New South Wales, and so that was a surprising thing for me. I always think of Victorians as being a bit more progressive than New South Wales, but it was found to be quite widespread. And its prevalence was inconsistent, I guess, with the very positive cultural diversity aspect. So, for example, in this particular project, 78% of people were supportive of cultural diversity. Victorians were supportive of it, but 56% had some level of concerns about Islam. So it's this sort of tension around we're supportive of cultural diversity, but had some level of concern about Muslims. And that's a social distance that was much more prevalent with that Muslim population than any of the other groups that we looked at. Like I said before, Islamophobia manifests in many different ways and to various degrees. And so countering Islamophobia, therefore, needs to take such an approach as well. The segmentation was identified as a means or a way to do that. We identified 5 groups, and these are what are up on the screen. And these are sort of, I guess, the way that we've tried to classify these groups. So there was a group that we call Islamophobic, and that's about 10% of the population. The second group, also Islamophobic, but has assimilationist tendency. So that's that notion of having elements of Islamophobia, but also accepting in a way if there's an assimilationist component to it. There's a group of undecideds that were pretty much undecided about everything that you could possibly ask them about. Progressives with concerns about Islam. Interestingly, Kevin and Rhonda, who many of you know, and I have just about to get a chapter that looks a bit more about that progressive with concerns about Islam. So it's people who have progressive ideas around the usual things, like around cultural diversity, multiculturalism, but have, when we ask questions around concerns around Muslims and Islam, had high levels of concern. So they're progressive on a whole range of levels, but have a particular negative concern when it comes to Islam. And then there's a group of about 20% who we call the progressives group. So these are the 5 groups that were found in the data. So I think this is a big project and it's been going for a while, and I won't go into too much detail about it, but I think what we've got up there is what was a very important aspect of this project and kind of what I was saying at the beginning, where we want to create the groups in order to try and identify interventions. And so one of the aspects of this was to then have these sort of recommendations, if you like, about where those interventions could occur for each of these groups. So just quickly, the Islamophobic group is, I think, pretty consistent with where we see that very negative end. It's always around that 10 to 12%. It's probably a population that we're not going to have much effect on. And, you know, they're a threat, I guess, to public order. They're a dangerous and risky kind of group, and it's probably in everyone's best interest that sort of sits with the authority of agencies that can police and report that group. It's not a kind of group that we want to just get any average person to try and make an intervention into because of that risky nature of it. Islamophobic with assimilist tendencies group, we found, actually I should preface all of this by saying, once we had these 5 groups, we actually took these classifications to community groups and did community consultations. So we had the CMY were one of those groups, the Bashar Ali Foundation was one of those groups. So we took them to a number of community groups to test these findings with those community groups, and that was a really interesting process. Kevin and I did that in the midst of COVID on Zoom with many of those groups. And that was an interesting part of the project too, to see whether or not there was a relevance in the way we've classified these groups. And that was very positive feedback from community organisations that they made sense. It reflected what they were seeing on the ground in communities. So that was a really good bolster, I think, in terms of the groups and what we came up with. So anyway, Islamophobic with assimilationist tendencies. It's a priority group we identified for maintaining social cohesion and public order, local action, pre-preparation for disputes. So this is a group we thought things like, protests around mosques, etc. There could be interventions at that level to persuade this group to move away from that more sort of extreme Islamophobic sentiment. The undecideds, I think this is a group that requires a lot more unpacking. There's a lot of diverse reasonings, I guess, behind why people sit in that undecided group category. It's not insignificant at 17%, so it's probably a group that could be unpacked a little bit more. But for us, it was like identifying the education that sort of decenters those stereotypes and rehumanises Muslims, would build resilience to the influence of Islamophobia in that particular group. Stories and representations that demonstrate ordinary hope. So there was lots of discussion around the use of civic and familial kind of interventions with this particular group. That I think it was the Bashar Ali Foundation were talking a lot about the influence on this group in terms of like having very positive role models, Australian Muslim role models in that as a persuasive element, particularly for that group, but also for the progressives with concerns. With the progressives and concerns, it was a group that we saw were quite optimistic about the potential for assuaging some of the anxieties that this group had. It was a group that we also think that sort of assimilationist thinking was something that we needed to, like, it was an intervention point to try and remove that sort of aspect of the group. It was a group that we thought could be influenced by a lot of those sort of local community civic initiatives, like Open Mosque Days, for example, that could show the sort of the influence or the potential for that intergroup kind of contact. Progressives, our main point around the progressives is it's a group like the sort of extreme ends. It's a group that we're like very confident and safe that that's a 20% of the population that are in a space that are positive in terms of trying to counter Islamophobia. It's also a group that we think is probably underutilised and could be used particularly for pro-social, anti-racist sort of action, and might be a group that we need to spend a little bit more time with in terms of trying to activate them to that cause. They're a ready and willing group that could be supportive in that sense. And maybe I'll just leave it there. I think the thing where we've got to with this one is that there's some really great intervention points, and I think the next step potentially with that kind of research is like how can these then be applied in that civic community space in particular, and it's where a lot of local organisations and local government kind of initiatives could be utilised, I think, in that space.